I was standing on my front porch in suburban Columbus with my hand on the screen door when Kelly said, "This is just temporary." And then she put a laminated list of house rules in my palm like I was the help. The paper was cold. My whole body went colder. Daniel was behind her with 2 suitcases, not looking at me, the way a son should look at his mother when he is asking for something that matters. He looked tired, cornered, maybe ashamed, but not enough to stop. I had already been bracing myself ever since he called that afternoon and said he needed to talk, and I had spent the whole drive home from Meyer telling myself it was probably money or work, or one of those grown-up problems you don't want to ask about. I opened the door anyway, because that is what mothers do. We open doors, we make room. We tell ourselves that love and caution can live in the same house. My house was quiet in that late evening way it gets when the dishwasher hums and the hallway clock sounds too loud. The good lamp in the living room was on the one Richard used to read beside, and I had a pot of coffee still warm on the stove, because I'd been waiting for Daniel to come by for Sunday leftovers all week. I had made pot roast mashed potatoes and green beans, because feeding my son had always felt like the one thing I still knew how to do right. Empty nest or not, I still kept a casserole dish ready like the right invitation might heal whatever distance had grown between us. Callie smiled the whole time she was explaining herself, which somehow made it worse. She said her apartment was in between situations, that they'd only need my guest room for a while, and that Daniel had already agreed to the arrangement. Then she pointed to the list, tapping each rule with one manicured finger. Kitchen lights off by 10. No shoes on the rug. Quiet hours. Bathroom cleaning schedule. I remember staring at that page, wondering when my own home started sounding like a rental agreement. I could feel something inside me, trying to speak up, trying to tell them this wasn't right, but my mouth had gone dry. Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes. Kelly kept talking, polite as church butter, and every sentence landed like a small lock turning somewhere in the dark. I let them carry the suitcases in anyway. I even said of course, because I was still too stunned to say what I meant. It wasn't until later, when I saw Daniel set their bags beside the bedroom, I'd already made up for guests, that the truth settled into me like a stone. He hadn't brought me a problem to help with. He had brought me a stranger and expected me to adapt. And when Kelly hung that list on my refrigerator with a magnet, I realized I was already being trained to stay quiet. So why did my hands start shaking when she asked me where I kept the extra towels? By morning, the house felt like it had been rearranged while I slept, and that was somehow worse than any argument would have been. My coffee cup wasn't where I always left it. The thermostat had been nudged up 2 degrees, like somebody had decided my skin was now a shared opinion. Even my mail was stacked in a different place, no longer by the front window, where I always sorted it with my first cup of coffee. Small things, maybe, but small things are how a room learns your name and then forgets it. I stood in the kitchen with my hand still on the cabinet door, telling myself I was being ridiculous. People settle in. People make themselves at home. That's what families do right. But the thought didn't sit right in my chest. It sat there like a pebble in a shoe I couldn't take off, and every step after that made me more aware of it. I kept waiting for my own house to feel familiar again, and it never quite did. Kelly was already awake, already moving through my kitchen, like she had a map I didn't. She opened drawers without asking, announced where things made more sense, and started talking in that bright, practical voice that left no room for disagreement. "We'll keep the dishes here," she said, "and this corner can be the coffee station. We. She used that word the way some people use a key, like it opens anything if you say it confidently enough. Daniel just nodded along. That hurt in a quieter way than I expected, because I knew him well enough to recognize when he was hiding behind easy agreement. He had always been the type to smooth things over to keep the peace, to act like problems got smaller if nobody looked directly at them. I used to think that meant he was gentle. That morning it felt more like I was being gently moved out of my own life. I washed the same mug twice without noticing my hands busy, while my mind kept trying to catch up. Every time I swallowed my irritation, Kelly seemed to take it as an answer. That's the part nobody tells you about being pushed around inside your own home. Silence doesn't stay neutral for long. It starts out as restraint, then it starts looking a lot like permission. And by the time she asked where I kept the extra trash bags, I realized she wasn't asking me as a homeowner anymore. She was asking me like I was already learning my place. The garage smelled like damp cardboard and old paint, and for a second I stood there with my hand still on the door handle, pretending I hadn't already seen enough to hurt me. Then I spotted the shape under the tarp, crooked and familiar, and my stomach went hollow. Margaret's recliner was shoved against the back wall, like it had offended somebody by existing. I walked over so slowly it felt like I was crossing into another person's life, and when I pulled the tarp back, the fabric whispered over the worn armrest, the way a church curtain falls after a funeral. That chair held years of ordinary love. Margaret used to sit there with her coffee, before sunrise wrapped in her robe, telling me about the neighbor's tomatoes or a recipe she wanted to try. Like those small things were the whole point of a good life. I used to think a house kept those memories on its own, the way wood holds heat after the sun goes down. But seeing that chair buried like trash, I understood something colder. If you let the wrong people in, they don't just rearrange furniture. They start rearranging memory. Kelly came into the garage behind me, all bright voice and careful innocence, and said, "We're just opening up the space." She said it like she was doing me a favor, like I should be grateful for the extra room, as if that room hadn't already been full of the woman who raised my son-baked pies for every holiday and left this place feeling lived in. I heard myself ask very quietly where she thought Margaret was supposed to sit now, and Kelly gave me that little patient smile people use when they think you're being emotional instead of observant. "It's only temporary," she said. Temporary has a way of sounding harmless, right before it turns permanent. I didn't argue. I couldn't not yet. I just stood there looking at the chair, and something inside me made a small, ugly sound, like a latch finally slipping open after years of pressure. It wasn't anger exactly. It was the sick recognition that they were not treating me like a man in his own home. They were treating the house like a stage set, and me like a piece of old furniture they hadn't gotten around to moving out. I sat down on an overturned storage bin beside that chair and stayed there until the garage went dim around me. The silence gave me room to think, and what I thought was simple enough to scare me, they weren't just moving in. They were trying to edit me out. And if I let that pass without a fight, what would they bury next? At 6 o'clock, the house was still half asleep, which made my little rebellion feel almost holy. I rolled the vacuum across the hallway carpet, let the coffee grinder shriek in the kitchen, and turned the radio up just enough to rattle the quiet they had been using like a blanket over my face. I wasn't doing it to be petty. I was doing it because I needed them to hear that I still existed in my own home. The sound bounced off the walls like a warning bell, and for a few minutes I felt my shoulders come back where they belonged. Then Kelly opened her door in silk pajamas and looked at me like I was a nuisance somebody had failed to warn her about. "Could you maybe keep it down?" she said. "All sugar and steel." I told her it was my kitchen, my vacuum, and my coffee. She smiled, that tight little smile people wear when they think politeness will make you smaller, and I could almost feel her testing whether I would fold. I didn't, not entirely, but I could already tell she hated that. I remember thinking how strange it was that noise could feel like dignity. Every hum of that grinder, every buzz of that vacuum was me putting one foot back on my own ground. I even stood a little straighter when I brewed my coffee, like posture alone might keep me from disappearing. It was a tiny victory, but when you've been treated like a decoration in your own house, tiny victories matter. The real humiliation came later, and it came dressed up like ordinary company. Kelly had one of her friends over, a woman with perfect hair and a loud laugh, and they were standing in the entryway talking about the guy doing work around here. Kelly pointed toward me with her coffee cup and said, "Oh, he handles things for us." For us. Like I was a hired pair of hands with a key. Like I belonged in the garage with tools not at my own table with my own name. I felt my face go hot. But what hurt worse was seeing Daniel standing there with that same shut-down expression he'd been wearing since she arrived. He heard it. I know he heard it. He didn't correct her, didn't even look at me. That silence landed heavier than any insult because it told me he was choosing comfort over truth, and I had always believed my son would at least do the decent thing. After they went back to talking, I stood in the kitchen with my mug cooling in my hand and realized the fight had already changed shape. Kelly was trying to shrink me in public, and Daniel was letting the room do it for her. I had expected a stranger to be cruel. I had not expected my own child to make that cruelty look reasonable. And once I understood that, I knew I was no longer dealing with noise. I was dealing with consent. The house had gone so quiet that night that I could hear the old floor settling under me like it was holding its breath. I was halfway to the kitchen for a glass of water when I heard Kelly's voice drift through the hall low and smooth, the way people talk when they think the truth belongs to them alone. I stopped without meaning to. That kind of silence makes a body go still before the mind catches up, and I hate that I knew it before I understood it. She was talking about getting things simplified, about just one signature, about how it would be easier for everyone if certain papers were handled now instead of later. Daniel mumbled something I couldn't make out, but I heard enough in his hesitation to feel my stomach drop. Kelly sounded calm, almost patient, like she was discussing grocery shopping instead of the roof over my head. That was what turned my fear into something colder. Angry people yell. People with plans speak softly. I stood there in the dark hall with my hand on the wall, and all I could think was how often I had let myself call this a misunderstanding, because the alternative was too ugly to face. There are moments when the room around you stays the same, but the shape of your life changes anyway. That was one of them. I didn't go in. I didn't give them the satisfaction of hearing me break. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed until morning, staring at the phone in my hand, like it had suddenly become evidence of my own bad choices. By sunrise, I was done pretending I could fix this with patience and good intentions. I started with the texts on my phone, every one of them, even the small ones that looked harmless, until I read them twice. Then I pulled old receipts from my desk drawer, the ones showing what I had paid for repairs, groceries, and furniture. They were already claiming as if they had paid for everything themselves. I took pictures of the papers on my counter, the ones Kelly kept leaving where I'd accidentally find them, and I photographed every room while their mark was still fresh in it. It felt strange at first to move through my own house like a reporter instead of a father. But that was the moment I understood something simple and brutal. If I kept relying on memory, they would keep rewriting the story. So I made one they couldn't talk over. And when Kelly came into the kitchen that morning, smiling like nothing had changed, I was already one step ahead of her, because now I knew what they were really trying to take and what I was going to need to prove it. Harold caught me at the edge of my driveway while I was pretending to sweep leaves into a neat little pile that kept falling apart in my hands. I remember his truck idling at the curb, his hand on the open door, and the way he looked at me for half a second too long. Men like Harold notice the details other people walk past. He didn't ask if I was okay, like a polite neighbor would. He said, "You look worn thin, Jack." That landed harder than sympathy, because it meant the change was visible. I almost lied. I had the answer ready, the one older men use when they don't want to admit their house is slipping out of their hands. I'm fine. Just tired. But the words stuck in my throat when I saw the way my own mailbox had been used like a prop in somebody else's play. So I said low enough that I almost didn't hear myself. My son brought trouble into my house, and I can't tell any more where being generous ends and being taken advantage of begins. Harold didn't interrupt. He just leaned one elbow on the truck and let the quiet do its work. That silence was a relief, all by itself. I told him about the rules, the moved things, the way Kelly kept speaking with that calm little smile, like she was explaining a budget instead of rewriting my life. I didn't give him every detail at once. I watched his face as each piece fell into place, and when I got to the part about the paperwork, his jaw tightened. Not anger, something colder, understanding, the kind that says this is bigger than hurt feelings. He asked me one question that changed the shape of everything. Are they staying because you invited them or because they're settling in like they don't plan to leave? I couldn't answer right away, and that told me more than any argument could have. Harold nodded once like he'd expected that silence. Jack, he said, folks who think quiet means consent don't usually stop at one ask. They keep testing the fence until somebody finally locks the gate. That image stayed with me. A fence doesn't fail all at once. It gives in board by board while everybody pretends not to notice. I stood there feeling the cold in my hands and the shame rising in my face. Not because I had done something wrong, but because I had waited too long to trust my own unease. Harold didn't let me stay there. He told me to call someone who handled elder law, someone who would look at the trust and the pressure and see it for what it was. By the time I went back inside, my phone felt different in my pocket. Not lighter, sharper. And when I found Ms. Porter's number, I realized I was about to make the first call that might actually change the direction of my life. But what she told me on that phone call made Harold's warning look almost gentle. The first thing Ms. Porter did was spread my papers across her desk like she was sorting evidence from a storm. I watched her fingers pause on the laminated rules, then on the texts, then on the invoice for furniture I had never agreed to buy. When she saw the photos of Margaret's chair stuffed under a tarp in the garage, her face tightened in a way that made my stomach drop all over again. She didn't look shocked. She looked certain, and that was somehow more powerful. She asked me to tell the whole story in order slowly, without apologizing for any of it. So I did. I heard my own voice get rough around the edges as I described Kelly's temporary move-in, the way Daniel went quiet whenever she spoke, the little changes that kept landing like pebbles in my shoe until I could barely stand straight. Ms. Porter kept writing, but she also kept looking up as if she wanted me to see that I was not being dramatic. I had spent weeks feeling like I was overreacting to family stress. Sitting there, I realized I had been trained to call a tightening net a misunderstanding. Then she said the words that changed everything. The trust protected my right to live in the house. My right. Not a favor, not a courtesy, not something they could quietly negotiate away while I was busy trying to keep the peace. She told me their pressure could be documented as coercive if I kept saving texts, voicemails, invoices, photos, and every demand they made about the house. It felt like someone had turned on a porch light in a yard I had been stumbling through in the dark. I sat there for a second, just breathing. A quiet room can feel gentler than a loud house when you've been living on edge. My hands were still unsteady, but now they were shaking for a different reason. Ms. Porter didn't stop there. She told me to secure my mail, immediately change passwords on every financial account, call the credit union, if anything looked off, and make sure no one had access to my statements or retirement information. You need to stop treating this like a family disagreement, she said, her voice calm but firm. This is about your home, your money, and your boundaries. That sentence landed harder than anything else. I had been raised to believe good fathers keep the peace, swallow the insult, and let family work itself out. But I could feel something in me finally refusing to bend. I nodded, opened my phone, and started making the first protective calls, while she watched over me like I mattered. And when I stepped back out into the daylight, I knew I wasn't walking home defeated anymore. So why did my chest still feel like I was about to find one more trap waiting on the porch? I learned that the easiest way to see somebody's true face is to stop arguing with it. So I got quiet. Not the kind of quiet that means I'd given up, but the kind that makes people reveal what they think they've won. Kelly started treating my agreement like a trophy she could carry around the house, and I let her. I answered her with small nods, neutral words, and that tired old expression men my age use when we're trying not to start a scene. Inside, I was counting everything. The width of the hallway, the distance from the kitchen table to the back door, the exact way her voice changed when she thought nobody would challenge her. It felt like I was walking through my own house with a measuring tape in one hand and my dignity in the other. One of those could be hidden. The other could not. By then, my phone had become a second memory. I photographed corners of rooms, cabinet labels, and the notes Kelly left on the counter like she was managing a rental instead of living in someone else's home. I saved every text she sent, even the ones that looked harmless on the surface, because I'd already learned how a sweet sentence can hide a hard edge. When she said, "We really need to make this place work for all of us," I heard the part she didn't say. "Your comfort is temporary, mine is not." I kept a folder on my phone and another in the cloud, and every new demand went in both. It was tedious, almost insulting, but there was comfort in the routine. She thought I was folding. I was actually building a paper wall she couldn't see yet. The strangest part was how bolder she became when I stopped resisting. She started speaking over me in my own kitchen, choosing where things should go, how long the lights should stay on, even what made sense for the house. Daniel looked thinner every day, like the air around him had turned heavy. He'd glance at me with that helpless look sons get when they know something is wrong and still can't bring themselves to name it. I wanted to shake him out of it, but I also knew that panic would only feed her. So I stayed calm. Calm is underrated. Calm makes people careless. One night I stood in the dark hallway after they went to bed and listened to the house settle around me. Every creak and hum sounded different once I stopped pretending this was normal. I could feel the net closing thread by thread, and I didn't pull back. I waited, because Kelly was getting comfortable enough to trip over her own confidence, and I wanted to be there when she did. But what I found in her latest message the next morning made even my quiet start to shake. The house felt too bright after she said it, like the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. A 4th of July barbecue. Kelly said it with that easy little smile people use when they think they've already won, then added that the paperwork would be handled that day with everybody there to witness it. I heard my own voice answer yes, almost before my pride could stop me, and the speed of it pleased her. I saw it in her eyes. She thought I'd folded. Daniel looked like he wanted the floor to open up and take him with it, which told me more than his words ever had. I didn't look at him for long. I kept my face mild, the kind of mild that makes people underestimate you, and I let Kelly bask in her little victory. It is a strange thing to sit at your own kitchen table and feel like you're watching someone arrange a stage in your house. She was setting the chairs, the food, the timing, all of it, like a person hanging curtains before a play. What she didn't know was that I'd already started reading the script. All afternoon, I moved through the house like I was only half there. I answered her questions, nodded at her plans for potato salad and burgers, even let her talk about how the family would finally see that everything was settled. That phrase landed wrong in my chest every time she said it. Settled. As if a home, a trust, and a lifetime of saving could be reduced to a neat little word whispered over a picnic table. I kept thinking about how people love a holiday crowd because nobody wants to make a scene in front of red, white, and blue tablecloths. They count on manners like handcuffs, so I used the pressure she'd built. I called a few people who mattered not to complain, but to make sure they came. Quietly, one by one. The aunt who asked too many questions, the cousin who still remembered how my wife used to set out deviled eggs on the porch, the neighbor who never missed a cookout and always noticed when something was off. I didn't need them to take sides. I just needed them to see. Truth hates sunlight, and Kelly had invited half the neighborhood to stand under it. By evening, I was calmer than I had any right to be. That calm sat inside me, like a locked drawer. Daniel barely touched his food, and Kelly kept looking at me as if she could already feel the paper in my hands, already imagined me signing whatever she'd decided belonged to her. I smiled back. Let her feel sure. Let her keep building. The higher she stacked it, the harder it would fall when the first witness asked the wrong question. Then I saw Ms. Porter's name light up on my phone, and I knew the real storm was still on its way. The more Kelly polished that afternoon, the more I could feel the cracks under her shine. She had the patio table set like a real estate open house, not a family barbecue, with a neat little folder beside the napkins and 2 pens lined up like she was about to close on a house she hadn't earned. Every few minutes she glanced at me, then at the guests drifting in from the driveway, as if my silence were already a signature waiting to dry. I kept my hands loose at my sides and let her talk. That was the hardest part, not the anger, not even the humiliation. It was sitting there while she described our plans for the kitchen island and the way the place could really open up if we just got the paperwork handled today. She said it with that smooth, cheerful voice people use when they want to make something ugly sound responsible. I'd heard enough women at church smile through a sentence and hide a knife in the tone to know the danger was never loud. It was polite. From the corner of my eye, I watched Daniel stand near the grill with his plate untouched, looking like a man trying to disappear in daylight. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But pity had been the rope around my own neck for weeks, and I wasn't about to hand it back. I thought about all the times I'd been told to be patient, to be understanding, to not make family uncomfortable. That kind of kindness can turn into a cage if you hand it over to the wrong people. Kelly opened the folder and slid a sheet toward me like she was offering dessert. "We can just make this easy," she said, smiling at the cousins and neighbors gathered under the string lights. "Then everyone can relax." I smiled back and didn't touch the paper. Let her think I was wavering. Let her keep performing for her audience. People like Kelly always get greedy when they think the room is already leaning their way and that greed is usually what gives them away. The folder sat there between us like a loaded silence, and I could feel her confidence rising with every witness she thought she had won. Then the front gate opened, and the first person I had been waiting for stepped into the yard. Ms. Porter came through the side gate with a leather satchel tucked under one arm, and the whole backyard seemed to hold its breath with me. Kelly's smile got wider, almost desperate, like she could charm her way through anything if she kept her chin lifted. She stepped forward as if she were welcoming an old friend to a house she didn't yet own, and I could see the whole act in her eyes before she even spoke. People like Kelly always look strongest, right before the floor gives way under them. She did that bright little laugh and said, "Elaine, I'm so glad you're here." We were just about to make everything official. The word official landed hard because she said it like the room already belonged to her side of the story. A couple of cousins glanced at each other. One of the neighbors stopped mid-sip of sweet tea. I didn't move. I had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing I could do was sit still and let a liar hear their own confidence echo back at them. Ms. Porter didn't smile. She didn't need to. She set the satchel on the patio table and started taking things out with the calm of somebody arranging dominoes in a line she had already studied. First came the trust papers, then the photos, then the printed messages I had saved for weeks. No speeches, no drama, just paper after paper landing on the table, like truth was something she could weigh in her hands. I felt my chest loosen and tighten at the same time. Justice has a strange sound when it arrives quietly. Kelly's face twitched when the first page went down. She asked too fast, "What is this supposed to be?" Ms. Porter finally looked at her and said, "It's a record." That was all. 2 words and the whole temperature of the yard changed. I watched Kelly scan the pages, her eyes moving faster than her breathing, and I saw the moment she understood this wasn't a private conversation she could steer. She had performed for an audience, and now the audience was reading the script she never expected anyone to keep. I could feel the old shame trying to crawl up my spine, the part of me that wanted to apologize, just to make the tension go away. But I stayed where I was. I had spent too long shrinking so other people could stay comfortable. This time, comfort was not the goal. Truth was. And when Kelly looked up and saw everyone watching her, I knew she had finally run into the one thing she couldn't sweet-talk. Because what happens when the room stops believing you? The quiet after Miss Porter finished was the kind that makes you hear your own heartbeat in your ears. I had spent weeks living inside Daniel's silence, and suddenly that silence had nowhere left to hide. He kept staring at the ground like it might open up and take the words back for him, but the room had already heard enough. I could feel every relative in that backyard leaning in, without moving the way people do when they sense a story is finally turning. Then Daniel lifted his eyes just once, and everything in him seemed to fold. He said he knew Kelly had been talking about the house for months. He said he'd seen the credit card statements piling up, seen the late notices, seen the way she kept saying, "This was all temporary," while she mapped out a future that didn't include me, unless I signed on the dotted line. His voice was so small it almost broke me. Not because I was suddenly soft about it, but because I recognized that tone. It was the sound of a man who had let fear make choices for him. I wanted to be furious at him, and I was. I wanted to tell him that standing by and hoping a problem would solve itself is just another way of choosing the problem. But when he admitted he kept thinking he could fix the debt, before I ever found out, something in me shifted hard and painful, like a locked drawer finally giving way. He hadn't been brave and he hadn't been honest, but he also hadn't been the mastermind Kelly wanted him to be. He had been weak in the exact way a lot of people are weak when they don't know how to say no to the person sitting closest to them. That didn't excuse a single thing. It just made the betrayal messier, uglier, and more human than I wanted it to be. I stood there feeling angry enough to go cold, sad enough to burn, and relieved in that awful way you feel when a lie finally runs out of breath. Truth can hurt like salt in a wound, but at least it stops the infection from spreading. I had spent so long guessing at what they were doing behind my back that hearing Daniel say it out loud felt like setting down a load I'd been carrying with numb hands. Kelly looked at him like he had just made himself a liability, and I knew right then their whole little arrangement had started to collapse from the inside. But Daniel still had one more sentence in him, and I could tell it was the one that would decide whether this was confession or just another delay. Kelly's voice got a little too bright after that, like she could paint over a crack if she spoke fast enough. She called everything practical, efficient, temporary, like those words could turn a betrayal into a home renovation. I stood there watching her smile wobble at the edges, and I realized she wasn't talking to me anymore. She was talking to the audience, trying to rescue the version of herself that had been working so hard in the background, but the backyard had gone too quiet for her to pull that off. Even the ice in the cups seemed louder than she was. I could see people doing the math in their heads the same way I had been doing it for weeks, and that was the first time Kelly looked truly uneasy. Not embarrassed, uneasy. There's a difference. Embarrassment wants to hide. Unease wants to defend. She took one step toward the table, then another, as if moving closer would make her sound reasonable. "This is being blown out of proportion," she said, and I almost laughed at how thin it sounded. That sentence had probably worked on people before. It had probably saved her 100 times. But now it landed like a wet paper towel over a house fire. Nobody bought it. I felt something cold settle in me. Not fear, exactly, more like clarity. She wasn't just losing control of the room. She was losing the story she had been telling herself. People like Kelly don't panic because they're sorry. They panic because the mirror finally stops lying. And when that happened, her eyes flicked toward Daniel, then toward Ms. Porter, then back to me like she was checking exits. That was the dangerous part. A cornered person can become careless. I could almost feel the air tighten around the next few seconds, like the whole yard was holding its breath for the wrong move. I kept my face still and let her talk herself into the open, because I knew panic makes people reveal what patience never could. She lifted her chin and said I was only trying to help this family. But the way she said family made it sound like a contract. That was when I understood her mask wasn't just slipping. It was starting to crack loud enough for everybody to hear. And the worst part was I could tell she had one more thing left to say, and it wasn't going to be pretty. I could feel the whole backyard waiting on Daniel like the air before a storm finally gives in. Kelly had gone still, but not calm still in the way a person gets when they know the floor beneath them is thinner than it looked. I kept my eyes on my son, not her. I had learned the hard way that some people feed on being watched, and I wasn't going to give her that comfort again. I told him, I'm not asking you to save your marriage. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I'm asking you to decide whether you're going to stand next to somebody who treats me like a problem to be managed. That landed harder than any argument could have because it wasn't about me winning. It was about whether he could still recognize decency when it was sitting right in front of him. He looked at Kelly, then at the folder in her hand, then down at the grass like it might offer him a way out. That hesitation told me more than a confession would have. It told me he had been living in the middle of two loyalties and calling it peace. I felt something in my chest go cold, not from anger exactly, but from the grief of realizing how long he had let this rot sit between us. Kelly tried one last soft voice, the kind that sounds reasonable if you don't listen too closely. She said something about everyone being stressed about family misunderstandings, about not making this worse than it had to be. I almost laughed at how polished it sounded. That was her whole trick-wrap control and concern and hope. Nobody notices the trap until their shoes are already stuck in it. Daniel swallowed, and for a second I thought he might drift back to her just out of habit. People do that. They cling to the familiar, even when it's hurting them, because change feels like standing alone in an empty parking lot after midnight. Then he took a breath and stepped away from her. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just one clean step that finally belonged to him. Nobody cheered. That would have made it easier than it was. The silence that followed was heavier, but it was honest for the first time all day. I could see in his face that this wasn't forgiveness and it wasn't redemption. It was something much smaller and much braver. It was him choosing not to keep disappearing beside her. And when Kelly realized he wasn't coming back into place, I saw the look in her eyes change like a door in the house had just closed somewhere deep inside it. I knew then that the worst part was still coming. I slid the packet across the patio table and watched Kelly's fingers hover over it like the paper itself might burn her. 7 days. That was all I gave them, and I made sure Harold was standing there close enough to hear every word, close enough to remember it later if I needed him to. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead. I had spent too long trying to be understood by people who only respected me when I sounded unsure. This time, I sounded like a man who had finally remembered his own name. Kelly read the first page, and I saw the color drain out of her face. Not because she was being attacked, but because she understood all at once that her confidence had been resting on nothing solid. The trust documents were right there. Ms. Porter's notes were right there. The texts, the photos, the timeline. Everything she had treated like background noise was now lined up in a row, neat as evidence, on a courtroom table. I could almost hear her mind scrambling, looking for a door that wasn't there anymore. Daniel didn't say much at first. He just stared at the packet, jaw tight, like he was trying to read a language he had helped create. Then he offered to handle the moving truck, to box things up, to call around for help. I expected resentment. I expected silence. What I got was smaller and sadder, and somehow more useful. He was trying to do one honest thing without asking me to make it painless. That mattered even if it didn't fix a single broken thing between us. Kelly tried one last smile, the kind that usually made people back down because it pretended to be reasonable. "This is excessive," she said, soft enough to sound offended and careful enough to sound civilized. I looked at her and told her it was settled. I said 1 week. That was it. No lectures, no debate. just a boundary with a calendar attached to it. Sometimes peace only comes after you stop confusing kindness with surrender. After they went inside, Harold stayed a minute longer and rubbed the back of his neck like he was deciding whether to say what I already knew. "She thought nobody would stand up," he said finally. I nodded because that was the part that still stung. Not that she wanted something from me, but that she believed I would quietly disappear while she took it. The porch felt colder after that, like the house itself had been listening. I stood there until the light started fading and thought about how strange justice can look before it becomes real. It isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just a date written down a witness on the porch and a man refusing to be moved out of his own life. But I knew Kelly was already doing the math in her head, and I knew Daniel was hearing it too, because the next day was going to tell me exactly who was still willing to carry the truth. The morning the truck backed up to my curb, the whole street seemed to go still with it. Even the dog 2 houses down stopped barking, like the neighborhood knew this was one of those moments you don't interrupt. I stood at my kitchen window with my coffee gone cold in my hand, watching the same front door that had been treated like a checkpoint for weeks turn back into an exit. Funny how quiet can feel heavier than shouting. It settles into the walls and makes you notice every little sound you've been swallowing. Kelly came out first with sunglasses on, face blank, in that polished way she used when she wanted to look above it all. Daniel followed with a stack of boxes hugged close to his chest, not looking at me, not looking at her, just looking tired, in a way that reached deeper than sleep. I didn't say a word. I had learned that some victories are too serious for celebration, and some people need to carry their own weight all the way to the curb before they understand what it cost. They moved like people packing up a life they had assumed would bend around them forever. I watched Kelly pause at the doorway, probably waiting for me to soften, to offer help to make it easier. I didn't. I just let the silence answer for me. That silence wasn't cruelty. It was the first honest thing we'd had in that house for months, and it felt cleaner than any speech I could have given. Sometimes dignity looks like doing nothing at all and refusing to apologize for it. As the boxes came out one by one, I noticed how much smaller the house looked behind them. Not emptier exactly, more like it had finally remembered its own shape. Daniel's shoulders stayed tight, and I could tell he was only now understanding that every day he'd waited had added another layer of damage none of us could take back. I wanted to tell him that truth doesn't age politely. It hardens. It asks for payment in full. When the last box went onto the truck bed, Kelly glanced back at the porch like she expected one final objection, one final mercy, one last opening to slip through. I stayed where I was. I let her see I was no longer the man who would fold just to keep the peace. The front door closed behind them, and something in me unclenched so slowly it almost hurt. But the strangest part was this. I still wasn't sure whether the hardest thing was watching them leave or waiting to see who they would become once they realized they couldn't come back. The silence after they drove away had a weight to it, like the house was waiting to see what I would do with my own breath. I stood in the hallway, with my hands at my sides, half afraid to move, because some part of me expected another demand, another excuse, another reason to stay braced. Then I heard the garage door open again, slow and careful, and my whole body went alert in the strangest way, as if grief itself had put its hand on the knob. Daniel came through carrying Margaret's recliner in both hands, his face set in that tight, almost embarrassed way men get when they know a gesture matters more than any speech they could manage. He didn't ask where I wanted it. He already knew. He walked it back to the front window, the same spot where the afternoon light always pooled across the fabric, and I had to look away for a second, because my throat closed up so hard it hurt. That chair had held my wife's shape for years. It had held her book in one hand, her coffee mug in the other, and all the ordinary little pieces of a life that had once felt permanent. Seeing it come home felt like someone had put a missing bone back where it belonged. I heard myself inhale like I'd been underwater too long. Daniel set the chair down and adjusted it by an inch almost reverently, then stepped back with his head lowered. No speech, no defense, no polished apology meant to make me feel better for his sake. Just the kind of quiet that admits what words can't fix. I'd spent so long listening for explanations that I almost missed how much respect could be shown without a single sentence. I went to the chair and rested my hand on the armrest. The fabric was cool, familiar, and suddenly I was 19 again, watching Margaret smooth her skirt before sitting down, acting like the smallest comforts were worth protecting. That was when it hit me. I wasn't just getting a chair back. I was getting a piece of myself back too, the part that had started to feel like it had been packed away with the furniture. For the first time in weeks, the room didn't feel occupied. It felt remembered. Daniel stayed where he was, and I could tell he was waiting for me to decide what this meant. I didn't give him mercy I hadn't earned for myself, but I also didn't turn him away. I just stood there beside Margaret's chair and let the afternoon settle around us like a truth neither of us could undo. Then Daniel finally lifted his eyes, and what I saw there made me wonder if he had come back for the chair at all, or for something he was still too ashamed to say out loud. The toolbox in his hand changed the whole temperature of the room before he even said a word. It wasn't a grand gesture, and that was what made it matter. I could tell he had come prepared to do something useful, not perform something pretty, and after everything that had happened, I noticed the difference, the way you notice when the weather finally turns and your body stops bracing for rain. He stood in my kitchen like he was asking permission to exist there again, and I felt that old reflex in me, the one that wanted to soften first, just to keep the peace. I didn't let it steer me this time. I looked at the toolbox, then at him, and I said, "You hungry?" He nodded so fast it almost hurt to watch. So I pulled a couple of chicken breasts from the fridge-set water on the stove and kept moving around the kitchen the way I always had when I needed my hands to stay busy so my feelings wouldn't spill all over the floor. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was crowded with all the things we both knew better than to name too quickly. That kind of silence can either heal a house or hollow it out, and I was trying very hard to choose the first one. He offered to replace a loose hinge on the pantry door, and I let him. No speeches, no excuses. Just the sound of metal meeting wood and the low scrape of a screwdriver turning in careful circles. I stood at the stove stirring the noodles, and suddenly I thought about how many men in my life had mistaken silence for approval. I had done that too, back when I still believed love meant making myself smaller so nobody would leave. It took me too long to learn that a door hanging crooked is still a door, but it won't protect anything until somebody finally pays attention. When we sat down, I could tell he wanted to rush the moment to stack it up with apologies and explanations until it felt like progress. But I wasn't ready to hand him that kind of relief. "I'm glad you came," I told him, "but trust is not the same thing as forgiveness." He stared at his plate for a long second before nodding. I meant every word. Forgiveness can be a feeling. Trust is behavior repeated long enough to earn a place at the table again. If he didn't understand that now he would, eventually. He ate slowly, like he was afraid any sudden motion might break what little calm we had managed to build. I watched him reach for the salt, then stop, then ask if I wanted him to pass it. That tiny moment hit me harder than I expected, because it was the first time in a long while he had acted like my equal instead of my dependent. I didn't know yet whether that meant change or just guilt, but I knew I needed to see the difference before I let my heart get ahead of my head again. And just as the plate started to empty, he set his fork down and said he had something else to tell me. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet message from a woman Kelly used to call a great contact, asking me if everything she had heard was true. I was standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee cooling in my hand, and I remember staring at that text like it might rearrange itself into something kinder. It didn't. By then, the story had started traveling on its own, the way smoke finds every crack in a house you thought was sealed. I never forwarded anything. I never made calls. I didn't need to. The truth had a way of doing what I couldn't bring myself to do with my own hands. A week later, I saw her name pop up in a local Facebook group attached to a post she had made about her business network and fresh opportunities. The comments were polite at first, the way people are when they're trying not to look nosy. Then the questions started. Then the silence. I didn't write a single word under it, but I knew enough about how people work to recognize the moment trust starts to slip. It's like hearing one board creak in a floor that's been carrying too much weight for too long. After that, every step feels different. What hurt her most, I think, wasn't one big public blow-up. It was the steady closing of doors. The people who used to lean in now kept their distance. The side work she relied on dried up one small referral at a time. Invitations stopped coming. The same social shine she had used like currency suddenly looked cheap in daylight. I almost felt sorry for her once, and then I remembered how calmly she had talked about my home, like it was something she was entitled to manage. Sympathy has limits when you've spent months being treated like a problem to solve. I had the folder still, the texts, the notes, the photos. Ms. Porter had told me to keep everything, and I did not as a threat, but as proof. That was the part Kelly never understood. She thought pressure made people fold. Maybe it does sometimes if the only thing holding them up is fear. But honesty is heavier. It sits there. It waits. And eventually, if the story doesn't match the facts, the story starts to crack first. One afternoon I got a call from someone she had once bragged would vouch for her no matter what. Her voice was careful, almost embarrassed, and she asked if I had documentation. I told her I did. I didn't say it with anger. I said it like a man closing a drawer. That seemed to say enough. When I hung up, I just stood there in the quiet and realized I wasn't chasing justice anymore. I was watching it arrive on its own, one uneasy conversation at a time. And the strangest part was knowing Kelly still didn't see it coming. So what would she do when she finally understood she couldn't talk her way out of the truth? When the last box was gone and the room stopped echoing with someone else's plans, I learned something I wish I had understood years ago. Peace that cost you your voice is just a quieter kind of misery. I sat in Margaret's chair by the front window, watching the light move across the floor, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for permission to exist in my own home. Kelly had counted on me being too polite, too tired, too worried about being called difficult. She mistook decency for weakness. That was her mistake, and it turned out to be a costly one. I didn't need to raise my voice to win back my life. I just needed to stop handing it over. Daniel called that evening, and I let the phone ring twice before I answered. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I wanted to remind myself I was allowed to choose when I opened that door. He was careful with his words now. So was I. We talked about groceries, the weather, and whether I had enough coffee in the house, like two people learning how to stand on the same ground again without pretending the cracks were never there. That mattered to me more than some dramatic apology ever could. I had spent too many years believing kindness meant absorbing whatever landed in my lap. It doesn't. Kindness without boundaries turns into self-erasure, and I will never live that way again. The house feels different now, not because it changed, but because I did. I keep Margaret's chair where the sun can reach it. I still water the little bed of flowers out front, and I still say hello to Harold when he walks by with his newspaper. Those small things are mine again. They always were, really. I had just let someone else talk me out of them. That's the part I think so many people recognize in their own lives, the slow drift, the little concessions, the way you keep telling yourself you're keeping the peace when really you're teaching people how much of you they can take. I learned the hard way that once you start protecting everyone else's comfort at the expense of your own dignity, resentment starts stacking up like unpaid bills. So now I choose differently. I choose quiet without humiliation, love without surrender, and family only when it's honest. If someone sat at your table, looked you in the eye, and made you feel like a guest in your own life, would you have stayed polite like I did at first? Or would you have done what I finally did and taken your voice back?